Good morning, dear students. Today we will be dealing with disaster management, or rather, disaster risk management, which belongs to Module 3. First and foremost, you should make a rewind towards the classes taken earlier, which involves hazard mapping, which includes identification of the hazard, again, vulnerability assessment, vulnerability analysis, risk assessment, risk analysis, then comes risk management or disaster risk management. So, it is the systematic process of using administrative directives, organizations, and operational skills and capacities to implement strategies, policies, and improved coping capacities in order to lessen the adverse impacts of hazards and the possibility of disaster. So, the most important thing that you have to give or understand in a highlighted manner or important manner is the systematic process. Now, during a disaster or during the situation of disaster, the response from people towards the same may be different. But from the administrative directives and organizations, when there is a systematic process that is developed to be implemented with operational skills and capacities, with ambient strategies and policies, which will improve the coping capacities of the society against a hazard, to lessen the adverse impacts of the hazard, which will possibly eliminate the possibility of a disaster. So, as you know, the disaster can be nullified or eliminated by reducing the adverse impacts of the hazards. And when a systematic process is developed from the administrative directives organizations, using the skills of operation and capacities of the society or of the area, including human capacity, by implementing different strategies, policies, which will improve the coping capacities and which will lessen the adverse impacts of the hazard, which will which will in effect reduce the disaster or possible to the disaster, is known as disaster risk management. Now, disaster risk management comes under a framework. The framework involves the outbreak of the event. The event, when it outbreaks, it leads to hazard and disaster. But in order to prevent the formation of a disaster, we have to make a disaster risk management system. Now, first and foremost phase when we are attacked by an event is actually the response phase, which is finalized by the recovery phase, where people are rehabilitated, the broken constructions are reconstructed, rescue services are activated, and we recover from the immediate effects of the event. Now, once we have recovered from the same, what follows is the identification of further risks and assessment of the risk, which will include analysis of the hazard, monitoring the hazard, analysis of the vulnerability, finding out the or determination of the risk. Now, this is followed by prevention and mitigation. Now, how will you prevent the same? How will you mitigate the same? How will you bring an end to the situation? So that is made use by land use planning, land management, non-structural measures, etc. Now, regarding the next element, that is preparedness, we have to understand that it includes early warning, evacuation, and emergency planning. And preparedness refers to our alertness towards the outbreak of the next event, where we have prepared or we are preparing ourselves against the formation of the disaster from the possible hazard or event that is going to occur or that might occur. Now, all these four elements like recovery phase, identification of risk phase, or prevention and mitigation preparation, or preparedness phase, all these things are singularly or they are connected with disaster risk management. Each of them are connected with disaster risk management, and it forms a cycle. When the event gets outbreak or recovery follows the event, risk assessment and identification follows, we followed by prevention and mitigation, and finally we prepare or we make preparations against the event by early warning, evacuation, and emergency planning. Something else that you have to understand at this phase is risk identification and assessment. Now, the term risk identification and assessment should be understood because it involves the determination and analyzing of the potential, origin, characteristics, and behavior of the hazard. So, the identification of risk involves in the analyzation or analyzing the potential. You know what I understand by the term potential? It's actually the extent of losses that a particular hazard or disaster can create. For example, the intensity of an earthquake is actually the extent of losses it can create, and it directly depends upon the magnitude of the earthquake. And these two things, like magnitude of the earthquake and intensity of the earthquake, directly gives or implicate upon the potential of the hazard. So analyzing the same, analyzing the potential of the hazard, analyzing the origin of the hazard, analyzing the characteristics and behavior of the hazard. All these things are involved in risk identification and assessment. For example, we can say that the frequency of occurrence of the hazard or magnitude of the consequences are part of risk identification and assessment. What do you understand by frequency? As you know, the number of times a particular disaster is occurring in a particular area in a given time period. That is frequency, whether it be 6 months, 3 months, or in a year, the number of times the disaster or event is occurring in a particular area. Each and every time it will have its own magnitude of consequences. The consequences faced or created by a particular disaster or hazard will have different magnitudes. And the magnitude also is the identification of the magnitude, the identification of the frequency of occurrence. All these things are included in risk identification and assessment. Next is application of risk reduction measures in mitigation. Now the thing is that we have a lot of methods and we identify risk by risk assessment, by risk analysis, all those things, and we apply next level, that is application of risk reduction measures. That is, we create some reduction measures for the risk in mitigation or in bringing an end to the situation. Now, this particular step involves planning and implementation of structural interventions or non-structural measures such as disaster legislation. So there are two aspects, that is structural intervention and non-structural measures. Now, in the case of structural interventions, we create structural defenses or structural, uh, structural or structures in short. In short, we make structures like seams or dams in order to prevent a particular hazard. Whereas non-structural measures are disaster legislation that will include making people aware of the disaster, making people how to handle a particular disaster, how to cope up with the situation, giving them education, giving them training. All those things will come under disaster legislation. So we are not creating in a particular structure or civil engineering structure, or whether it be any structure or concrete structure, or we are not making any structural intervention, but they are non-structural measures which will involve a know-how to fight the disaster. And it is usually given to the people and the area which faces the situation. Next is disaster preparedness and emergency management. Now, the activities and measures taken in advance. I repeat, how will you prepare for an exam? The learnings, the teachings, the short notes, the notes, the study material you have, the amount of knowledge that you grasp, how much you read, how much you write, how much you draw, all these things are the activities that are taken as a preparedness for examination. Similarly, the emergency situation, which is unpredictable or which is foreseen, can be managed by making proper preparations, which includes activities and measures which are taken in advance to ensure effective response to the impact of a hazard. So a hazard might be there, an event might occur creating a hazard, and that will create a lot of impact, and a proper response measure, a proper response activity schedule will actually include these measures for disaster preparedness, which are related to timely and effective warnings also, which will include evacuation and emergency planning. So a particular response to a particular disaster may be different depending upon the type of the disaster. In certain areas you can fight the disaster, in certain areas you have to evacuate, in certain situations warnings will help you, and in certain situations the planning will help you, the emergency planning will help you. In other terms, sometimes all these things together will help you. So disaster preparedness and emergency management will include the activities and measures which are taken in advance to fight the particular situation, which will include the warnings, evacuation measures, emergency plannings, all those things. Now next is recovery and reconstruction. Recovery and reconstruction. Now, in order to recover from a particular phase, you require time. And the decisions and actions taken after a particular disaster during that particular period will include the recovery phase, and keeping in view the restoration of the living conditions of the affected people when we make constructions, when we make when we provide shelters, when we reconstruct the transportation system, when we reconstruct the bridges, dams, etc., we undergo a particular recovery phase and reconstruction phase. Later, we reach we can call, or we reach a cycle that is known as disaster risk management cycle which will involve or include a particular cycle which starts with a disaster. So once a disaster begins, or once an outbreak of a disaster starts, first phase is the response phase where we respond to it in a particular manner. Then comes we have a rehabilitation recovery phase, so where we recover and rehabilitate ourselves, and now we just focus upon preventing and maybe bringing an end to the situation, and preventing the same and mitigating the same, followed by making yourself prepared in case of the outbreak of the disaster further. So this particular cycle goes, and again when there is a disaster we have a response. Now once you have prepared, the response will be better. Again, rehabilitation recovery will be at a faster rate. The prevention and mitigation will involve the study of the risk, vulnerability, etc. And you do all your best to mitigate further. You prepare yourself for further disaster, and you make an outlook for the worst condition that might occur from a further disaster, and you make yourself prepared for the same. So this is what is happening in the cycle that is known as disaster risk management cycle. Next important term that is connected with disaster risk management is disaster risk reduction. Now regarding disaster risk reduction, the short form stands as DRR, that is disaster risk reduction. Now, disaster risk reduction involves the concept and practice of reducing disaster risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters. Now, you have to understand each and every term of disaster risk reduction. Actually, disaster risk reduction is a concept where we practice to bring a reduction in the risks involved in a disaster. And the question arises, how do you do it? They are through some systematic efforts where we analyze the factors of a disaster. Then, what are factors of disaster? The factors of disaster are vulnerability, risk, capacity, three major factors. So we make a systematic effort to analyze all these three. Then we manage the causal factors of disaster, which also will include the exposure to hazards, which will include vulnerability of the people and property, which will also include the wise management of land and the environment. Then finally, it will include the improved preparedness for adverse events. So as I told you earlier, in disaster risk reduction, we make some practices that are systematic in nature, and finally, we become successful in managing the situation through reduced exposure to hazards, by lessening the vulnerability of the people and property, by making a wise management of land and environment, because the land and environment will be exposed to the situation a lot. So when we make a construction, when we make a building, when we make a road, when we make a bridge or any other construction, or when we create a deforestation, or when we convert a a cultivating land into constructing land, all these things are made in a wiser manner, or all these things are managed in a wiser manner, and the environment and everything is taken into consideration, and thus we keep in mind the reduction of the disaster and keep in mind the risks involved, and thus we make a wise management. Finally, we reach in a situation where we prepare ourselves, or we improve our preparedness for adverse events. That is, we foresee the events that are most adverse in nature, or the most adverse conditions of the events are foreseen, and we prepare ourselves for them, making our preparedness in an improved high level manner. Now, given the importance of DRR in the international policy arena, five priority areas are underscored in the Hyogo framework for action for the year 2005 to 2015. That is, when the importance of DRR, disaster risk reduction, was recognized, it was brought forward as an international policy from the year 2005 to 2015 in a framework of action known as Hyogo Framework for Action, where a conference was conducted and five priority areas were underscored or given highlight or given importance. First was governance. Governance of the area, governance of the disaster, governance of the topography, governance of the resources, governance of the vulnerability risk capacity, and governance of the exposure, all these things. Now it involves risk identification, assessment, monitoring, and early warning. Again, knowledge management and education. Now you people are getting education, you people are getting knowledge regarding disaster and disaster management and disaster risk management, all these things. Now this particular knowledge management and education is a priority which was underscored in the Hyogo framework from 2005 to 2015. Now, it also includes a priority area known as reducing underlying risk factors. That is, an area or the particular country or a particular region is considered, hazards are considered, the risk factors that are involved are considered for reduction. Next is preparedness for effective response and recovery. Now, as we saw in disaster risk management cycle, or we saw the last phase was disaster, preparedness. So finally, the most important underscore was given to preparedness for effective response. How will you respond to a particular situation or event? How much are you prepared? The preparation for the same, the preparation to make an effective response and recovery. The response can be in many forms from many people if people are given a chance to respond. But the most effective methods are identified, and those things are taught to people and they prepare themselves, and these are used for recovery. The Hyogo framework for action was followed by the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction from 2015 to 2030 at the third United Nations World Conference on DRR, which took place in March 2015 in Sendai, Japan. The most important thing that you have to note is that earlier the DRR was for 2005 to 2015, and at the end of the 2015 framework, by the month of March 2015 in Japan, a place known as Sendai, the World Conference was held by the third UN, and the Hyogo framework was succeeded by the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Now, the four things or four cornerstones of disaster risk reduction as per Sendai framework is something different. Now, as per Sendai framework, it is valid from 2015 to 2030. That particular framework involves four parallel and complementary lines of actions which will consider to reduce exposure of disasters and achieve a more sustainable approach to development. That is, four parallel and complementary lines of actions. We have four action lines which are complementary to each other and they are parallel also. That is, one can stand without the other. They are parallel and they do not coincide. Again, we have to understand that though they can stand without each other's help, they are complementary in nature. That is, one particular action will complement the other action. Paraspara Puragam. So, they are community and stakeholder participation. That is, both the community and the stakeholder should participate in disaster risk reduction. The stakeholder involves the authority and community involves the common people. Again, public policy actions. Now, policies or action policies for the public during a particular disaster. The policies and actions which are to be implemented by the public at the outbreak of a particular event or before or nearing an event. Safer construction and urban development. That is, development of the urban areas and making of constructions that are more safe. For example, earthquake resistant structures will resist earthquakes. Development of a culture of prevention. That is, when you make a construction, when you make a use of the land, when you make a use of the environment, a culture of prevention of disaster should be developed, foreseeing the chances of the outbreak of a hazard or a disaster. There is wise use of the land, wise use of the management of the systems and capacities of the area. Then comes something known as disaster prevention. Now, disaster prevention is defined as those activities taken to prevent a natural phenomenon or a potential hazard from having harmful effects on either people or economic assets. It doesn't mean that the outbreak of a particular event is suppressed. The outbreak of a particular event may be there or may not be there, but the disaster is prevented somehow by the activities that are taken and by which will prevent the natural phenomenon from making harmful effects. The natural phenomenon will be there or the potential hazard will be there, but the harmful effects on people or economic assets are getting prevented by disaster prevention. I hope you got the point. The disaster or natural event will occur, but the effect upon people and assets are prevented. Now, it will broadly, when we say the same, it involves disaster prevention refers to measures taken to eliminate the root causes that make people vulnerable to disaster. When people are vulnerable, when people are weak, when people are easily attacked by the disaster, and when they are not in a position to cope up with the situation, their causes for the same, which make people in such a state, are found out and eliminated in disaster prevention. Suppose we take the term COVID, pandemic situation. A number of deaths are occurring and people are vulnerable to the disease. But the measures taken to eliminate the same is vaccination. Now, these things will enhance the health of the people, and the root cause that will make people vulnerable to the disease is eliminated. So, that is an example for the same. Now, the basis of disaster prevention is for a disaster prevention to be successful, a priority planning is required. A priority planning. I think that you can understand the term priority. When you have a number of activities to be done in the same day, within an hour, or within a short period of time, you give priority to the work which should be done first, second, third, etc. When multiple commands are given to a computer, the computer will get stuck or hang. Similarly, when there are multiple tasks for you to perform at the same time, you will not be in a position to do anything efficiently. So what you do is that you create a timetable in the short period of time. You prioritize each and every activity that you have to perform. Based on the priority given, you identify the work to be done first, second, third, etc., and you will be able to complete your task. Similarly, planning of prevention of disaster, where it is to be successful, a priority planning is required. Now, the two things that are involved in the planning of prevention of hinges is hazard identification. First and foremost, priority should be given in identifying the hazard, identifying the actual threats facing a community, which is followed by vulnerability assessment. That is, evaluating the risk, evaluating the capacity of the community to handle the consequences of a disaster. So priority number one is identification of the hazard. Next is vulnerability assessment, which will involve risk and capacity of the community to be understood. Now, once these issues are put in order of the priority, emergency managers can determine the appropriate prevention strategies. So, the hazard identification, either in an area, there can be one or more hazards. For each hazard, there can be each areas which are vulnerable. There can be each areas that includes a lot of exposure and risk, and each and every area, there will be different areas regarding capacity of the community, which will enable them to handle the consequences of the disaster. In some other case, there will be only single hazard. In some other case, there are many hazards. Each hazard will have its own vulnerability and risk and capacity and vulnerability that is involved, exposure, etc. that are involved. So, making a study of everything and giving them priority will help managers to make an action plan by which they can act accordingly during emergencies by determining the appropriate prevention strategies. So depending upon the priority or understanding the situation, emergency managers can determine the appropriate prevention strategies based on the type of hazard that is occurring. Now, when we speak of disaster prevention, there are two types of disaster prevention mainly, that is primary prevention and secondary prevention. Now, in primary prevention, we reduce or avoid the risk of the event itself occurring by getting rid of the hazard or vulnerability. That is, the initial or the primary cause for a disaster is cut off. That is, you are getting rid of the hazard or you are getting rid of the vulnerability. For example, to avoid overcrowding or to deforestation or chalk drainage and provide them services, all those things are examples. Now, secondary prevention means to recognize promptly the event and to reduce its effects. That is, you identify the event and its effects are reduced. That is secondary in nature. That is, you are allowing the event to happen, you are allowing the effect to come out, but what you do is that you reduce the effects. So this is managed by staying alert to the possible displacements of population, being ready to provide immunization, food, clean water, sanitation, and healthcare, etc. Now, this is a kind of secondary prevention. In the primary prevention, the root cause of the hazard itself or root cause of the disaster itself is cut off. In secondary prevention, the hazard is allowed to happen, but the effects are cut off. Now, in disaster mitigation, it refers to the lessening or limitation of the adverse impacts of hazards and related disasters. That is, it mitigates or cuts off, brings an end to, or it lessens, or it limits the adverse impacts of the hazard and related disasters. So, as you know, there are two things. Either the hazard, we are not going to suppress the event that is going to happen. We are limiting the adverse impacts of the hazards that is related to the hazard, that is related to the disaster. But that is known as disaster mitigation. We cannot cut off the event, but the impacts are reduced. Now, the primary objective of disaster mitigation are twofold. They are mainly hazard likelihood reduction and risk consequence reduction. Now, hazard likelihood reduction involves the objective which is only appropriate for a few natural hazards. It is not possible to reduce the occurrence of many hazards, but the likelihood of floods occurrence can be reduced by mitigation measures such as sea defense walls. Now, that is a kind of hazard likelihood reduction. Actually, the flood is controlled, but water level will increase. The event actually is occurring in nature, but the hazard likelihood is reduced by defense walls. Now, this is happening in our AC road construction also. Next is risk consequence reduction. Now, this is a kind of reduction in the impact of the hazard. Here, the reduction in the impact is created by reducing the exposure or vulnerability. If the area which is exposed to a particular event or a natural event or a hazard is reduced, or if the vulnerability is reduced by strengthening the areas, the risk consequences are reduced. It involves ensuring that the populations or structures or other systems are able to withstand such an event with a few negative consequences as far as possible. Now, if there is a construction which will prevent the erosion of a particular area, the erosion occurs, but the construction will prevent or resist the erosion. Because the particular area is vulnerable to erosion, We are reducing the vulnerability. So in reducing both hazard, likelihood and risk consequence, the primary aim is to decrease the risk of death and injury of population. So first and foremost, human beings are under consideration. So we reduce or we keep an aim of primarily upon the decrease of death and injury. Now the secondary aim is to decrease damage and economic losses inflicted on public sector, that is infrastructure, and to reduce private sector loss. So first the living beings are considered, then the non-living things are considered, which are important economically to the public, which are give infrastructure to the public, which aid the public in many ways. So now we'll come to types of disaster mitigation measures. Now there are mainly two types of disaster mitigation measures, that is structural mitigation measures and non-structural mitigation measures. Now structural mitigation measures refers to physical constructions that will reduce possible impacts of the hazards, which includes engineering measures, construction of hazard resistant and protective structures, and infrastructure. Whereas non-structural mitigation measures involve policies, awareness, knowledge and development, public commitment, methods and operating practices, including participatory mechanisms that will involve public participation, provision of information, early warning systems, which can reduce risk and related impacts. So non-structural mitigation measures are given to the people. They involve some policies, awareness, knowledge. Now the subject that you learn is a part of non-structural mitigation measure. You are getting an awareness, you are getting a knowledge, you are developing a public commitment, your methods of operating practices are known to you. So all these things can reduce the risk and related impacts. Now comes overall adaptation strategy. There is something known as ecosystem. And when ecosystem is considered, we have ecosystem-based option. And then another type of adaptation strategy is EBA hybrid options. That is, which includes hybrid operation, which involves both ecosystem and certain kinds of constructions using environmental or natural resources. Infrastructure-based options usually of dams, shore protection, etc., which includes the infrastructure or construction or the structural aspect. Now, another adaptation strategy is political and social option, that is development of planning, early warning system, land use planning, etc. Now comes disaster preparedness. Now, disaster preparedness encompasses the knowledge and capacities developed by governments, professional response and recovery organizations, communities, and individuals to effectively anticipate, respond, recover from the impacts that likely imminent or current hazard events or conditions. That is the definition. And towards the understanding, I would like to say that now disaster preparedness is some kind of preparedness that you make against a disaster beforehand through some kind of knowledge, through some kind of capacities which are developed by governments, through some kind of resources, through kinds of strategies, through some kind of systems that are developed beforehand by professional people by professional people also, which includes professional response, including recovery organizations, communities, individuals who effectively anticipate, wait for the hazard or event, then they respond, then they recover from the impacts or the current hazard events or conditions. There is a kind of preparedness by the people which involves the government, professionals, etc. through certain kind of strategies, through some kind of organizations and communities who will actively participate in foreseeing, anticipating, waiting for the disaster, respond to it, recover from it, then recover from the impact, recover from the hazard, and recover from the conditions. That is a kind of disaster preparedness that is involved. Now, the components of a comprehensive disaster preparedness strategy. That is, we need a kind of strategy that is involved in preparedness. For example, the defense strategy of the country is a kind of strategy that they keep for themselves, awaiting a response from the neighboring countries which will lead to a war. So it's a kind of strategy, it's a kind of preparedness, it's a kind of onlook where they are most alert against each and every move of the enemy. Similarly, the disaster, the event or the natural event is monitored thoroughly, and there are a lot of components of a comprehensive disaster preparedness strategy. That is, hazard, risk and vulnerability are always assessed and analyzed. The response mechanisms and strategies are always updated. Plans are prepared to fight the disaster. Coordination among people of the authority, government, and the local people to fight the same is enhanced and ensured. Information management during a disaster and before a disaster is thoroughly investigated and kept alert and kept safe. Early warning systems are implemented. Resource mobilization, that is movement of resources during a particular situation, and foreseeing a particular situation, the movement of resources is carried out. Public education, training and rehearsals are made in advance. Community-based disaster preparation is also made, which will include the people of the local area, people of the higher authorities, skilled trainings, etc. Now, types of disaster preparedness. Now, disaster preparedness involves target-oriented preparedness. Now, it also includes task-oriented preparedness. It also includes disaster-oriented preparedness. So there are three kinds of disaster preparedness. You can prepare for a disaster in three major ways. First one is target-oriented preparedness. Now here, the preparedness plans are targeted upon specific or upon the target. It is very target specific. The plans, etc., require different types of planning for the vulnerable groups of women, children, elderly, and disabled. Here, we target upon a particular community or a particular sector of people which are more vulnerable. They are unhealthy people, sick people, women, children, elderly, and disabled. So these people are most vulnerable to death or to attack or health loss during a particular disaster situation. So they are targeted, and we make them prepared, or we make ourselves prepared to protect them. That is target-oriented preparedness. Next is task-oriented preparedness. That is, we are concentrating upon specific activities, certain tasks to prepare ourselves against disaster. So specific groups jointly develop activities based on one of the community's plans to evaluate the community's capability to activate the preparedness plan in a real emergency. So in a particular emergency situation, what is to be done in the initial phase and how the activity should be developed or unfolded during the situation is a kind of preparedness that groups make, are made in groups. These preparedness are made in groups of people, and the community's plans are given. Eventually, these tasks enable the development of plan revisions, employee training, and material resources to support readiness. So, certain areas of the community people are targeted for different types of tasks, and they are given a kind of training, and they are made prepared to act in a particular situation. And elsewise, what happens is that people will respond in different manners and in an unsystematic manner, which will create confusion. So a systematic preparedness with regard to task is made, and people are assigned with duties and tasks what to be done in a particular situation. Disaster oriented preparedness is the next type. Now in this particular type, depending upon the type of the disaster, depending upon the occurrence of the hazard, depending upon the type of the impacts of the hazard, we make the preparedness. So this addresses the likelihood of occurrence of a specific disaster. An emphasis is given to structural and non-structural mechanisms. As I told you earlier, structural mechanisms involve structural aspect, and non-structural mechanisms involve people, policies, strategies, etc. Now, disaster response and relief. The responses to a disaster are a set of activities that are taken during a disaster or immediately following a disaster, which involves the saving of life and protection of property. Now, that is disaster response and relief. When you respond to a particular disaster, you protect life and property that can occur at the time of the disaster or which follows the event for a period of end of the disaster. So the immediate responses and relief involve saving of life and protection of property. Now the factors that determine the nature of disaster response is something else. That is, the type of, it will depend upon the type of the disaster, the ability to take pre-impact actions. That is, by the term pre-impact actions means before the impact occurs, you have to make some actions. So it will prevent. It will make it's a kind of disaster response. It will prevent the outbreak of the disaster. So, or the enhancement of the disaster. If the actions are taken before the impact of the disaster, though the disaster is on the way. So the severity and magnitude of the disaster is also considered. The capability of the sustained operations. That is, you should know the capability of the operations that you are going to perform. The limitations and the capability of the operations should be understood very well. Identification of likely response requirements. That is, you have to identify the response requirements. What all responses are required at each and every time of the disaster outbreak. Now, the requirement of effective response. Two important factors that will effectively support the effective response is actually the information or the complete information that you gain about the particular situation. So a complete and thorough and accurate information will help you in making a very effective response to the particular outbreak. Now, information alone cannot help you a lot in the absence of resources. So trained people being a resource, money being a resource, systems like transportation systems, communication systems being a resource. See, all these resources will support the effective response. Now, next is disaster response planning. The roles and responsibilities are defined, policies and procedures are developed, and generic tools for responses are identified and developed. That is, a kind of disaster response planning involves the roles and responsibilities which are defined to different kinds of people, different sectors of people, different communities of people, which involves policies and procedures developed, and generic tools for responses are identified and developed. Now, in disaster response planning, people are selected and given training, and those people are entrusted those responsibilities are to perform those responsibilities during a particular disaster to avoid confusion of mass action. So, next is types of disaster responses. First and foremost, the immediate response will involve or include search and rescue, then first aid and emergency medical care, evacuation, evacuation center management, development of standard operation procedure like SOP, immediate repair of community facilities and services, relief delivery, coordination and communication, psycho-social counseling and stress debriefing. This is very important. That is, during a particular disaster situation, people will be losing a lot of their relatives, people will lose a lot of their wealth, so they will be depressed, they will be facing some psychological shocks. So psychological counseling is given and stress debriefing. When people discuss things, the stress is released. So a kind of stress debriefing is carried out. Then it involves medical services also. Last but not the least, something we have to give importance is relief. Now it is defined as a provision of assistance or intervention during or immediately after disaster to meet the life preservation and basic subsistence needs of those people affected. That is a kind of relief, to relieve from the problem. It can be in the form of money, it can be in the form of shelter, it can be in the form of food, or it can be in the form of cloth. So all these things will involve, which can be immediate, short-term or protracted duration. For a short-term duration or a protracted duration. That is a duration that is set by the system. Now we have to understand a project management cycle where the disaster is in the outbreak, then a complete monitoring is carried out in the project management cycle. Upon the outbreak of a disaster, we assess the disaster, we plan and design the disaster, then we implement the planning and designing, which is further reviewed and evaluated again before the next disaster. So the cycle continues. Now last but not the least, we have to understand a specific list of international relief response organizations like AAH, Action Against Hunger, CARE, CARE, Caritas Internationalis, Catholic Relief Services, Emergency Nutrition Network, Doctors Without Borders, Food for Hungry International, Food for the Hungry Hunger, International Committee of the Red Cross. Now you have to understand that Mother Teresa and the orphanages in India, governed by Mother Teresa Foundation, they get fundings from Red Cross and foreign international mutual fund, etc. So federation news were there in the paper regarding the same, and so that's a kind of response or relief organization which provide funding. Similarly, Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, international organization. For Migration, International Rescue Committee, IRC, Lutheran World Federation, Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, Mercy Corps, that is MC, etc. So these relief response organizations will come into action when there is a disaster which is international in nature, which will provide each and every area and country with fundings and help wherever necessary upon request, or sometimes they will come on their own. So this in short is a kind of coming to an end to the third module, which includes disaster management or disaster risk management. Thank you.